Pyongyang, North Korea. June 25, 1950, 4 kr in the morning. While most of the world slept, 75,000 soldiers of the Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel, and by dawn, the silence of the Korean peninsula had been shattered forever. Within days, United Nations forces were scrambling to respond, and within weeks, men from Canada, the United States, Britain, Australia, and a dozen other nations found themselves thrown into a landscape that would prove as lethal as any enemy they had ever faced. Not the hills, not the artillery, not the bitter cold alone. It was the ground beneath their feet. This is not the story that gets told in the history books. It does not appear in the regimental dispatches that line the walls of military museums in Ottawa or Washington. It was not celebrated in the newsreels that flickered across cinema screens in 1952. But in the quartermaster reports, in the field surgeon's logbooks, in the handwritten memos passed between supply officers in the dead of a Korean winter, a different war was being fought. A war waged in leather tanneries, in cobbler workshops, in the quiet offices of the Canadian Army's Directorate of Equipment and Stores. And in that war, Canada won something decisive. November 1950. The temperature in the Chosin Reservoir region dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. American Marines and Army infantry were already retreating in catastrophic conditions, and among the most devastating and least reported consequences was what was happening inside their boots. Men who had marched through freezing mud for 72 hours straight were pulling off their footwear in aid stations to discover feet that were blackened, swollen, and in the advanced cases, already beginning to die. Trench foot, a condition the military world had believed was buried somewhere in the mud of Flanders alongside the Great War's dead, had returned with a vengeance. The condition works with terrible patience. Prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions causes the blood vessels in the foot to constrict. Circulation slows. The tissues, starved of oxygen and warmth, begin to break down. In mild cases, soldiers lose sensation and mobility. In severe cases, gangrene sets in and amputation follows. During the First World War, the British Expeditionary Force recorded over 75,000 cases of trench foot in a single winter. By the time the Korean War entered its second winter, medical officers attached to United Nations forces were looking at the same trajectory, and they were terrified. Seoul, South Korea. December 1950. At a forward dressing station 12 kilometers south of the front line, a Canadian Army medical officer named Captain Douglas Whitfield recorded in his journal that he had treated 43 men in a single 48-hour period for cold weather foot injuries. He noted, with a precision that would prove invaluable to researchers decades later, that the majority of cases came from American units wearing the standard issue M1944 combat boot, a rubberized, rubber-soled design that had been developed hastily in the final stages of the Second World War. A smaller number came from British units in their standard ammunition boot, and among the Canadian soldiers he treated, the numbers were strikingly, almost suspiciously, lower. He wrote in that journal, which now sits in the collection of Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa, that he could not yet account for the discrepancy, but he intended to find out. The answer, it would turn out, had been quietly taking shape in the tanneries and military procurement offices of Ontario since 1946. To understand what Canada got right, you first have to understand what everyone else was getting wrong, and why footwear in a modern war is far more complicated than it appears. A military boot is not simply a protective covering for the foot. It is a dynamic mechanical system that must simultaneously insulate, flex, grip, drain and breathe, often under conditions that place all of those demands in direct conflict with one another. Insulating a boot makes it less breathable. Waterproofing reduces flex. Thick soles improve grip but add weight. Every design is a series of compromises, and the armies of the mid-20th century were, in many ways, still compromising badly. The American M1944 combat boot, which became the standard footwear for most United States Army infantry going into Korea, had been designed with European winter warfare in mind. It featured a rubber lower half bonded to a leather upper, a design sometimes called the shoe pack, intended to keep moisture out by sheer impermeability. The logic seemed sound. If water cannot get in, the foot stays dry. But the logic had a fatal flaw, and it was one that military planners had somehow failed to absorb despite centuries of evidence: soldiers' sweat. The human foot produces moisture constantly, and when that moisture cannot escape, it accumulates inside the boot, creating the very wet, warm, then cold cycle that produces trench foot from the inside out. The American boot was, in the words of one Canadian quartermaster officer writing in February 1951, a very efficient vessel for trapping the foot's own perspiration against the skin in precisely the conditions where you least want that to happen. The British ammunition boot, which Canadian forces had historically drawn upon as their template, was in some respects the opposite problem. Constructed from chrome-tanned leather with a hobnailed sole, it was a boot of considerable durability and reasonable breathability, but its water resistance was dependent entirely on the application of dubbin, a wax and grease compound that had to be regularly reapplied to remain effective. In the field, in the mud of the Korean hills, regular maintenance of that kind was a fantasy. Within days of sustained operations, the chrome-tanned leather became saturated, and a saturated leather boot in sub-zero temperatures becomes rigid, cracked, and as protective as a damp cardboard box. It was against this backdrop that the Canadian development, which had begun almost accidentally in the immediate post-war period, assumed its full significance. Ottawa, Ontario, March 1947. In a 4-page memorandum addressed to the Director of Equipment and Stores, a procurement officer named Major Harold Fenwick outlined what he described as persistent deficiencies in the thermal and moisture performance of standard issue footwear, as reported by veterans of the Northwest European Campaign. Fenwick had spent 1944 and 1945 in Belgium and the Netherlands, and he had watched men come out of the Scheldt estuary with feet that looked like they belonged to corpses. He was not willing, he wrote, to sign off on another generation of soldiers going to war in boots that would do the same to them. What Fenwick proposed was a fundamental rethinking of the leather used in Canadian military footwear, starting with the tanning process itself. Leather tanning is one of the oldest industrial processes in human history, and by the mid-20th century it had bifurcated into two dominant methods. Chrome tanning, which uses chromium salts to cure the hide, had become the industry standard because it was fast, cheap, and produced a consistently soft, pliable leather. But chrome-tanned leather has a significant weakness. It absorbs water readily and loses its structural integrity when wet and then frozen. Vegetable tanning, by contrast, uses organic compounds derived from plant materials, typically bark, oak galls, or sumac, to cure the hide over a much longer period, sometimes many months. The resulting leather is denser, stiffer initially, but extraordinarily resistant to moisture penetration once properly treated. It retains its structural rigidity under wet conditions in a way that chrome-tanned leather simply cannot match. Canadian tanneries in Ontario, particularly those operating in the Kitchener-Waterloo region, had maintained significant vegetable tanning capacity long after the process had become commercially unfashionable elsewhere. It was a matter of geography and industrial tradition as much as anything else. But it meant that when Fenwick began looking for a supply chain that could support his proposed boot redesign, the infrastructure he needed already existed within a day's drive of Ottawa. What emerged from the subsequent development process, finalized in a design specification dated September 1948 and designated the Canadian Army Boot Ankle General Service, was something that looked, at first glance, almost indistinguishable from its predecessors. It was a high-ankle boot in the British ammunition boot tradition, black, constructed from full-grain leather, with a defined heel and a substantial sole. But in its construction, it was radically different from anything then in standard Allied service. The upper was constructed from vegetable-tanned leather of a minimum specified thickness of 3.2 millimeters, sourced from Canadian tanneries working under contract with the Department of National Defence. The leather was then subjected to a proprietary hot stuffing process, in which a mixture of neat's foot oil and a beeswax-derived compound was driven into the grain of the hide under heat and pressure, occupying the fibrous structure of the leather at a molecular level rather than simply coating its surface. The result was a leather that repelled water not because of an external barrier, but because its own internal structure was water-resistant throughout. Unlike Dubbin-treated boots that lost their protection the moment the surface coating wore away, a properly hot-stuffed vegetable-tanned boot maintained its water resistance through repeated wetting and drying cycles, through mud and abrasion, through conditions that would strip the surface treatment from any conventionally waterproofed leather within days. The sole construction was equally significant. The Canadian boot used a triple-stitched welt construction, a method in which the upper and intermediate welt strip and the outsole were joined through 3 separate rows of stitching rather than the single or double row used in most contemporary military footwear. This was not merely belt and suspenders redundancy. The triple welt created a mechanical structure that distributed stress across a wider area, dramatically reducing the tendency of the sole junction to crack or separate under the repeated flexing of extended marching. It also meant that water infiltration through the welt seam, one of the primary failure points of any sewn sole construction, was reduced to a fraction of what it would be in a single or double-stitched boot. Quartermaster records from the Korean period show that the average Canadian boot required sole replacement after approximately 14 months of active field use, compared to an average of 7 months for British ammunition boots and as little as 4 months for the American shoe pack in comparable conditions. The heel counter and toe cap were reinforced with internal stiffeners of the same vegetable-tanned leather, providing structural support that maintained the boot's shape under the lateral stresses of moving across rough, uneven terrain. And the last, the form over which the boot was constructed, had been specifically redesigned to provide more room in the toe box, a seemingly minor detail that had profound physiological consequences. A boot that allows the toes to move freely maintains circulation more effectively than one that compresses them. And in sub-zero temperatures, that circulation is the difference between a functional foot and the beginning of frostbite. Busan, South Korea, February 1951. Captain Whitfield, the medical officer who had first noticed the discrepancy in trench foot rates between Canadian and other Allied forces, had by this point compiled enough data to write a formal report. It was addressed to the Medical Services Branch of 25 Canadian Infantry Brigade, and it ran to 11 pages. Using admission records from forward dressing stations along a 60-kilometre stretch of the front, Whitfield calculated that the rate of cold-weather foot injuries among Canadian soldiers was approximately 1/3 that of comparable American units and roughly half that of British units operating in the same sector under the same conditions. He was careful to control for other variables. Canadian soldiers were not, on average, spending less time in the forward trenches than their American or British counterparts. They were not receiving superior instruction in foot care, though they were receiving the same instruction. The most significant variable he could identify was the boot. His report recommended that the Canadian boot design be shared with Allied quartermaster commands, and that joint production be explored to supply American and British forces with footwear of comparable specification. The recommendation was noted, filed, and to a considerable extent ignored. Inter-service and international procurement politics are a labyrinth at the best of times, and in the middle of an active war, with supply chains already strained to their limits, The prospect of fundamentally redesigning the footwear of hundreds of thousands of soldiers was not one that any Allied commander was eager to take on, but the data kept accumulating. By the winter of 1951 to 1952, United States Army medical statistics showed that cold weather foot injuries had become one of the leading causes of non-combat casualties in the Korean theatre, accounting for more lost service days than any single category of battle wound. Congressional inquiries would later examine why American troops in Korea had suffered such extensive cold weather casualties, and footwear was identified as a contributing factor, though the full extent of the Canadian comparison was not widely publicized in American reports. The reasons for that absence are worth dwelling on. Military procurement is, at its core, a deeply political enterprise. Acknowledging that an Allied partner's standard-issue boot significantly outperformed your own was not something that American or British quartermaster generals were inclined to put in writing, not in documents that might circulate beyond the immediate chain of command. There was also, frankly, a degree of institutional pride involved. The armies of the United States and Britain were the dominant military powers of the Western Alliance. The idea that Canada, a country of 15 million people with a relatively modest military establishment, had solved a problem that their own far larger research and procurement apparatuses had failed to solve was not a comfortable one. What survives in the archival record is fragmentary, but suggestive. A 1952 internal memorandum from the United States Army's Quartermaster Research and Development Command references Canadian design specifications for cold weather footwear and notes that they are under evaluation. A British War Office file from the same period contains a handwritten annotation on a report about Korean theatre casualties reading "See Canadian Boot Report, NB." Whether these references led to any immediate procurement changes is unclear. What is clear is that the standard-issue footwear of American and British forces in Korea remained largely unchanged through the conflict. The legacy of the Canadian boot, however, extended beyond Korea in ways that proved more durable than any individual procurement decision. The design principles that had been formalized in the 1948 specification, vegetable-tanned leather, hot stuffing moisture treatment, triple-stitched welt construction, a last designed for physiological function rather than merely conventional appearance, became the foundation for subsequent Canadian military footwear development through the Cold War period and beyond. Veterans of later Canadian deployments in Cyprus, in Bosnia, in Afghanistan would inherit boots that carried the engineering logic of those post-war Ontario tanneries in their construction, even as the materials and manufacturing methods evolved around that logic. And the broader principle that Whitfield's report had articulated so clearly in 1951, that the performance of a soldier's boot is not a trivial logistical detail, but a genuine determinant of combat effectiveness. That principle eventually found its way into military thinking across the Alliance, though the route it travelled was roundabout and rarely credited to its Canadian origin. There is a photograph in the Library and Archives Canada collection, taken sometime in the winter of 1951 by a Canadian Army photographer whose name is not recorded. It shows a group of soldiers from the Royal Canadian Regiment sitting on ammunition crates outside a forward position somewhere in the Korean hills. They are cold, clearly. Their breath makes small clouds in the air. Their faces carry the particular expression of men who have been in the field for a long time and are not sure exactly when that will end. But their boots, visible at the bottom of the frame, are intact. The soles have not separated. The leather is dark with moisture, but uncracked, undeformed, holding its shape around the foot exactly as designed. It is a small thing. In a war that produced some of the most devastating set-piece battles of the 20th century, that left an entire peninsula divided and scarred in ways that persist to the present day, the integrity of a boot sole seems almost absurdly minor. But for the men wearing those boots, it was not minor. It was the difference between a foot that worked and one that did not. It was the difference between staying in the line and being evacuated. It was, in the most literal and unglamorous sense possible, the difference between fighting and not. Retired Sergeant William Abernathy of the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, was interviewed in 2003 for a Veterans Oral History project conducted by the Canadian War Museum. He was 81 years old, and he had spent the winter of 1951 to 1952 in the hills above the Imjin River. He was asked what he remembered most vividly about that winter. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "The Americans next to us, their feet. You'd see them in the aid station and it would turn your stomach. Ours were all right. I always thought it was just luck, but it wasn't luck, was it?" It was not luck. It was Harold Fenwick's memorandum, and the Ontario tanneries, and the engineers who had spent 3 years redesigning a boot that most generals never thought twice about. It was the vegetable tanning and the hot stuffing and the triple-stitched welt. It was the quiet, bureaucratic, entirely unglamorous work of getting the details right before the shooting started. Wars are decided by many things: firepower, strategy, logistics, intelligence, morale, weather, and sometimes plain fortune all play their parts. But wars are also decided in ways that military history rarely pauses to acknowledge, by the accumulated sum of 1,000 small decisions that determine whether the men doing the fighting can physically do it, whether they can walk, whether they can stand, whether their feet after days in the mud and the cold are still feet. In Korea, in the winter of 1950 and the winters that followed, Canada got that decision right. The boots that marched out of those Ontario tanneries, stitched triple tight and tanned the old slow way, kept Canadian soldiers on their feet when the mud and the cold were taking everyone else off theirs. That is not the most dramatic story of the Korean War. But it is a true one, and in its own way it is not a small one either. The trenches are gone now. The mud has long since frozen and thawed and frozen again across 6 decades of Korean winters. The men who wore those boots are mostly gone too, or very old, sitting in the late afternoon quiet of their living rooms, with memories that not many people ask about anymore. But the boots themselves, or rather the design logic they embodied, the understanding that the foot is not an afterthought but a foundation, that keeping soldiers mobile is as important as keeping them armed, that lesson did not die with the war that proved it. It lives in the engineering specifications filed in archives in Ottawa, in the quartermaster blueprints that gather dust in folders nobody opens very often, in the journals of medical officers who noticed something and wrote it down. It lives in the simple, stubborn fact that Canadian soldiers in Korea came home with their feet.